referred in my last lecture to the two major tendencies in the development and progress of the sciences. A, the rapid accumulation of new knowledge and the expansion into new unexplored territories, which naturally tend to make science more extensive and more complicated. B, the integration or synthesis or consolidation that is going on side by side, which naturally tends to make the sciences simpler and more comprehensive. I shall immediately proceed to explain why I lay emphasis separately on these two tendencies. It was not so long ago, not even 70 years, that even the working scientists thought that all the major discoveries in science had already been made, and all that was left for the future generation of scientists to do was to give the finishing touches, like removing some of the angularities, rectifying the anomalies, improving the various techniques, developing newer and more accurate measuring instruments, and pushing the precision of the measurements to the next decimal place. Even the more progressive among the scientists, who repeatedly emphasized that it was unwise to set limitations to the possibilities of science, had in view discoveries based on more refined techniques rather than conquest of new fields. I shall illustrate the type of new discoveries they had in view by two typical examples. Extensive measurements had been made on the direction and the magnitude of the magnetic field of the Earth at various observatories. As you probably know, the Earth's field is not precisely in the north-south direction, and there are other deviations too from an ideal distribution that one should expect on the basis of the Earth's being a uniformly magnetized sphere. The great mathematician Gauss, to whom frequent references were made yesterday, made a detailed and precise analysis of these magnetic constants observed at different places on the surface of the Earth. Even the mathematical technique of the analysis was Gauss's own and has since found extensive applications in many other fields. From such an analysis, he came to the surprising conclusion, this was more than a century ago, that the bulk of the magnetism observed at the surface of the Earth, to be more precise, 94% of it, should be attributed to sources located underneath the surface of the Earth, and the remaining 6% equally definitely to causes located outside. With the supreme confidence so characteristic of him, he marched much further than any mathematician or physicist of his day would have ventured. He proposed a probable mechanism outside the surface of the Earth for accounting for this residual 6% of the observed magnetism of the Earth. The mechanism that he proposed would have been considered impossible by lesser men than Gauss on the basis of the then available knowledge. The mechanism that he postulated was electric currents in the upper regions of the Earth's atmosphere. The atmosphere was known to be a good conductor, good insulator for electricity, and hence incapable of sustaining any electric currents. But Gauss's confidence in the genuineness of the residue of 6% should have been uncanny to induce him to postulate such a current. I shall quote his own words to enable you to realize this supreme confidence of his. Before doing so, I hasten to add that we know today that Gauss was right. This is what Gauss says: if we seek for the immediate causes, partly or wholly, without the earth, and confine ourselves to known scientific grounds, we can only think of galvanic currents. But the atmosphere is no conductor of such currents, neither is vacant space. Thus, in seeking in the upper regions for a vehicle of galvanic currents, we go beyond our knowledge. But our ignorance gives us no right absolutely to deny the possibility of such currents. We are forbidden to do so by the enigmatical phenomena of the aurora borealis, in which there is every appearance that electricity in motion performs a principal part. The quotation ends there. I'm speaking for myself now. How many birds at one stroke, particularly when his contemporaries knew that the birds were not there. We know today that it is these charged layers in the upper regions of the atmosphere that make all long-range radio propagation possible. Indeed, the radio waves can travel several times round the earth under favorable conditions because of the presence of these ionized layers in the upper atmosphere. I shall just mention in passing one other discovery which arose out of refined measurements. Lord Rayleigh made some systematic and accurate measurements on the density of nitrogen gas prepared from different sources. He found a small but persistent difference between the density of nitrogen isolated from the atmosphere and that obtained from chemical sources, which pointed to the probable presence of an impurity in his atmospheric nitrogen, which his method of isolation from the atmosphere had not been able to eliminate. The result, as we all know, was the discovery of argon and of several other rare gases, which have since been assigned a unique and in some respects an honored place in the family of elements. The clue to the presence of heavy hydrogen came the same way, though later it turned out that the original density measurements which gave the clue were not correct. The examples which I cited just now are typical of what the scientists at the end of the last century thought was left over for future generations to do. Professor Millikan, who attended the 1893 session of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, records that an eminent physicist rose to address the assembly, I'm quoting him, and spent his time giving thanks that he had lived to see the completion of the great edifice of science. What a comforting thought. It reminds me of a king who tried to learn cosmology. The king is a real one, only I don't name him. And when he found the mathematics beyond his comprehension, wished that he had been present at the creation. He could have given useful advice which might have resulted in the creation of a world much simpler and more easy of comprehension than the one we find ourselves in. The complacency that I have been trying to describe by these examples happened, of course, to be the calm before a storm. About the same period, Kelvin gave one of the evening lectures at the Royal Institution in London under the title Clouds over 19th Century Physics. And even he could not have realized the tremendous downpour that was to follow soon after, and does not by any means look like stopping even now. The year 1895 witnessed the discovery of X-rays, and the next year of radioactivity, to be followed soon after by the discovery of the electron, the postulate of the quantum theory, and the theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, wave mechanics, and the litter of new fundamental particles. We have now with us some anti-particles too. All these are happening at such a terrific rate that even the most serious physicist is completely swept off his feet in this torrent. In my giving the chronology of the great events, I have naturally given a more prominent place to the work of consolidation that I spoke about yesterday than to actual accumulation of new knowledge. In order to emphasize the rate at which new knowledge is accruing, I wish to mention immediately that it is enormously more rapid than the work of consolidation. I am speaking in the language of the schoolboy who, after hearing his companion dilate on the many good things in his village, merely replied that in his own they had all these good things and many more. Having mentioned the impressive theoretical advances, I just add that on the experimental side, the advances are naturally more extensive. There are many reasons for the process of consolidation not keeping pace with the accumulation of new knowledge. A single striking new observation may open up new and almost limitless vistas. I shall mention just one such. The hydrogen atom, which, as you know, is the simplest among the atoms, consists of just a proton, which is positively charged, in which the mass of the atom is practically concentrated, and an electron revolving around it at some distance from it. Now, both the proton and the electron of the hydrogen atom are spinning. There is a restriction imposed on these two spins by the requirements of the quantum theory, namely that the axis of the two spins should be oriented either parallel to each other or anti-parallel. Depending on whether they are parallel or anti-parallel, the atom has slightly different energies. Taking the spin axis of one of them as reference, as the axis of the other flicks from one of the permitted orientations to the other, there is either absorption or emission of a quantum of energy whose magnitude can be readily calculated. It corresponds, in the language of the radio, to a radiation of about 14 megacycles per second, or a wavelength of about 21 centimeters. A radiation of this frequency is being received from interstellar space, which shows obviously that hydrogen is present there in appreciable quantities. Now, one can take the intensity of this radiation as a measure of the density of the hydrogen atoms present there. Further, the observed radiations have not quite the frequency to be expected of them, which shows again that the radiating atoms are not at rest, but are moving. The difference between the two frequencies being a measure of the velocity of the radiating atoms along the line of sight. Taking the density and the velocity of the motion of the hydrogen atoms as typical of those of other atoms too, one gets a picture of the structure and the mechanics of our own galaxy. One thus finds that our galaxy is much larger than we could see with our optical telescopes, and shows a spiral structure not quite easily discernible in telescopic observation. And the movements of the spiral arms also can be determined. There are radiations of other radio frequencies too, from sources which do not radiate in the visible region. Hence, a whole new subject has grown up, namely radio astronomy, which is a powerful supplement to ordinary astronomy studied with the optical telescope. One of the exceptionally strong radio sources, for example, has since been identified as two nebulae colliding and interpenetrating, which obviously must be a very rare event. Apart from the enormous intrinsic value of the subject, my main interest in giving it here is just to illustrate how rapidly science can grow. And no general description could have given an adequate idea of the growth. Hence, I have taken the liberty to present these examples in some detail, and I emphasize again that though selected from the branches of science with which I am familiar, they are typical of what is happening in all other branches too. The growth may be more or less rapid in the different branches, and the imbalance between rate of accumulation of new knowledge and the rate of consolidation may be of different magnitudes, but they all point to the same conclusion, namely that for various reasons the process of accumulation of new knowledge can be enormously greater than that of consolidation. This is so by the very nature of these two phases in the growth of the sciences. I never dissuade a man from trying an experiment, says Maxwell. If he does not find out what he is looking for, he may find something else. It reminds me of Alice in Wonderland asking of somebody, I don't quite remember of whom, for her way. The answer is, it depends on where you want to go. I am not particular, says Alice. Then you will reach somewhere if you walk long enough, is the profound reply. It should be remembered that the author of Alice in Wonderland and of Alice Through the Looking Glass was a mathematics don. These books are as much for the scientist and the philosopher as for the children. We have today innumerable bands of scientific workers in all parts of the world who, in this sense, always reach somewhere, and their contributions to the sum total of our knowledge is of no mean order. Consolidation of the type that will simplify large branches to a considerable and coherent single unit is a rare event. The result has been enormous proliferation and subdivision, which gives the man of science some deep concern, this concern has permeated even into mathematics. Professor Hilbert, the last probably of the great veterans, expresses this concern forcibly in the following words. The question is forced upon us whether mathematics is once to face what other sciences have long ago experienced, namely to fall apart into subdivisions whose representatives are hardly able to understand each other and whose connections for this reason will become ever looser. I neither believe nor wish this to happen. The science of mathematics, as I see it, is an indivisible whole, an organism whose ability to survive rests on the connection between its parts. I'm adding, this inevitable thing has since happened to mathematics too. One is tempted to exclaim, if gold rusts, what is to become of iron? It is true that the frontiers between the different branches of science are continually being broken, but then new ones appear where there was none before. Many hybrid, probably I should say, to be more precise, hyphenated branches grow up, like biophysics or radiobiology or paleomagnetism, to mention just a few. But the main result is that we have today only narrow specialists and no general scientists, barring always a few doubtful exceptions. After all, the exceptions are there because, according to the proverb, they are requisite to proving the rule. We speak, for example, of the spectroscopist. Pardon me, I am mentioning too big a branch. I should have said either diatomic or polyatomic band spectroscopist, or soft X-ray absorption spectroscopist, or Lyman ultraviolet line spectroscopist, or infrared spectroscopist, or X-ray fluorescence spectroscopist. Even in a narrow branch like thermionics, I have to specify whether the specialist is an oxide cathodist or a hollow cathodist or a thoriated tungstenite. I wish to designate him correctly. If I wish to designate him correctly, he may be just a nuclear spin moment man with so many legs to walk on. We may find some day ourselves in the position of the centipede of the nursery rhyme, who was asked, "Pray, which of your legs do you put forward first when you walk?" The centipede could not answer which, and having been asked the question, could not even decide which he should put forward first, and so could not move. I read a delightful story related by Lord Moulton, the famous patent law expert, and who was also the chairman of the Dyestuffs Corporation in UK. He relates the story of his meeting a German scientist on the top of a mountain. I found, I quote Lord Moulton, that he was a chemist and began to talk on a chemical subject. He told me he was only an organic chemist. Began to talk about coal tar and pharmaceutical products. He then told me he was a coal tar byproduct chemist. That did not beat me, because I had been just fighting a case of canary yellow, that is the name of a dye. So I slipped into the subject of canary yellow. Still the same ominous silence for a time, and then he said, I am only a coal tar chemist dealing with blues. I racked my brain for a coal tar blue. I had had to advise on some case, and I gradually slipped into that. Then he finally defeated me, because he said in equally solemn tones, but equally proud of the fact, I only deal with methyl blues. Looking back with a certain nostalgia to an earlier age, when they were much more than mere X3B or Y23-56 or some such narrow specialist, one realizes that the great Lord Rayleigh was probably the last complete physicist, just as Poincaré was probably the last complete mathematician. I have to go much farther back in history if I have to look for a complete scientist. It was probably Helmholtz, who started as a great surgeon, was then professor of anatomy in Berlin, and later professor of physiology, and wrote during that period the two great classics, The Sensations of Tone and The Physiological Optics. Then became professor of physics, covered a wide range from energetics to electromagnetism and hydrodynamics, and also did some fundamental work on the axioms of geometry. If we wish to look for the complete man, we will have to go very much farther back in history. It may be Leonardo da Vinci. The scientific literature that is coming out today is so vast that even the specialist cannot keep track of the papers published in the narrow branch in which he is specializing. In some branches, it has already reached the stage when it may be quicker to solve a problem starting from scratch than to consult all the earlier work in the field. I am reminded of a student who had been working with Professor Jacobi, the great mathematician, who was a brother of the great Orientalist. It was several months he had been with him, and he hadn't started his work. And when the professor asked him why, he said, I haven't yet read all the earlier available literature on the subject. And then the professor replied, my dear man, if your father had waited till he had seen all the girls in the world before he married one, where would you be? So one is not surprised that frequently research papers appear in the journals of learned societies in which some of the results have already been anticipated, maybe many years before. In the earlier days too, it was not always that scientists read one another's papers. If they avoided reading them, it was for a different reason, and a more sophisticated one. They did not wish to lapse into habits of vicarious thinking. The scientist had frequently been accused of using his scientific jargon even when it is not quite necessary. We have the classic example of the professor who, when he had cut his finger, exclaimed, "Dear me, I fear I have excoriated the cuticle of my digit." Joking apart, A person of the eminence of Faraday, while writing to Maxwell, does in all seriousness ask the same question. There is one thing I would be glad to ask you. When a mathematician engaged in investigating physical actions and results has arrived at his own conclusions, may they not be expressed in common language as fully, clearly, and definitely as in the mathematical formulae? If so, would it not be a great boon to such as we to express them so, translating them out of their hieroglyphics, that we also might work upon them by experiment? But at least all the specialists formerly could speak the same language and understand one another. Today I am not quite so sure. When the great mathematician Poincaré was elected to the division of letters of the French Academy, he had the unique distinction of being a member of both the scientific and the literary divisions of the Academy. A wag offered the explanation. It was one of the functions of the literary division to edit the authoritative dictionary of the French language, which they could not have done without the help of Poincaré, since they could not understand some of the words which he coined, as for example, automorphic functions. With the present day specialists coining each his new word, the problem of understanding one another becomes even more acute. Soon after the last conference on the peaceful uses of atomic energy held at Geneva, I gave a short review in which I mentioned that one of the major achievements of the conference, apart from the large amount of factual information that was exchanged among the various participants, was to have brought on the same platform so many different disciplines, ranging from nuclear physics at one end through radiology, spectroscopy, electronics, solid-state physics, metallurgy, chemical technology, to radiobiology and genetics at the other end. That's all the contact that one can possibly have today between the different disciplines. Lest I be misunderstood as drawing a pessimistic picture, I wish to affirm that it is my intention to draw a realistic picture, and if there is any touch of pessimism, it's inherent to the present situation, and it is for us to rectify it. The disabilities associated with the inevitable over-specialization is not peculiar to the sciences. Some of them have been discussed by educationists in connection with single faculty universities. The problems are naturally closely related. The main function of a university is not so much to train specialists or even to impart mere knowledge as to offer a truly liberal education. This can be imparted in many different ways, through the arts, the humanities, or through the sciences. It's very desirable it is done through all of them. The scientist needs the humanizing influences of the arts and the classics, and the humanists similarly need the disciplining through the sciences before they can claim to have acquired the liberal education. The different sister faculties, the faculty of arts, of sciences, of engineering, act as very good correctives to one another and ensure that the education that one acquires is really balanced and integrated, and in any case safeguards against any possible lopsided development. It's a little strange. While the scientist readily concedes the need of the humanizing of the by the other faculties, those in the humanities are not so easily convinced of the need for any disciplining in science. This is unfortunate, since purely as a means of acquiring liberal education, the pure sciences have much to offer. What is called the scientific outlook, by which I mean the willingness to face facts squarely, to draw from them logical conclusions, to accept them without any mental or the other reservations, and to act in a manner that would conform to the conclusions, is a virtue which we all value. Surely this can be acquired through many different disciplines, but more easily and effectively through a scientific disciplining than through the humanities. So the major problem in education, as in scientific research, is to keep the right balance between the different disciplines and the different branches of science. I have not yet touched on technology. I wish to devote the whole of my concluding lecture to this subject. As I mentioned early in my last lecture, it is one of the major functions of science to gain control or mastery over nature and use it for the larger good of mankind. Even as a means of acquiring liberal education, some very eminent authorities would place a great value on technology. If in addition it is also useful, which all of us concede readily, then it is what I would call double blessedness. One cannot ask for more. I shall deal with them in my next lecture. Thank you.